Thank you very much, Paloma, for this kind introduction. And my sincere thanks, of course, also to Guillermo Solana and to the entire team here at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza. But most of all, of course, thank you to all of you for joining me here this evening to discuss the work of Lucian Freud with a particular view towards nuances of intimacy in the work of the artist. As Paloma so very kindly mentioned, my name is Daniel Herrmann. I'm the curator of modern and contemporary projects at the National Gallery in London. And at the National Gallery, it is my job to tell the story of painting from the 1500s to the present day. My particular responsibility is, in that respect, the second half of the 20th century, and especially in the second half of the 20th century, Lucian Freud is really one of the most important figurative painters. It was then a really great pleasure for me when presented with the opportunity to work together with the colleagues here at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza. Not only does the museum hold a fantastic collection of art from both the past and the 20th century, and owns wonderful paintings by Lucian Freud, the museum has also consistently tried to further research, to really put forward research into its collections and into the artists it exhibits. The commitment to scholarship and new ideas is also what drives the National Gallery, and I was delighted when the two museums were able to embark together on this project about Lucian Freud. Now, from the start, when discussing the possibility of this exhibition, it was clear to Paloma and myself that Lucian Freud's work deserves a close look. Freud was born in 1922 in Berlin, Germany, as the grandson of the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. And for more 10 years, Lucian, his father, the architect Ernst Freud, his mother, the philologist and art historian Lucy Freud, and his two brothers lived in the capital of the Weimar Republic. What I would like to show you next is actually a picture of Freud's living room in Berlin. Now, there's no actual Freud painting in this living room, but what you can see is that right there in this wonderful arrangement of furniture from the Wiener Werkstätte style of interior design, you can see a reproduction print. You can see a photo gravure, a reproduction print of Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne, which is a very, very famous painting of Bacchus encountering Ariadne on a bacchanal that is famously painted by Titian around, well, slightly later than 1500, and it's in the collection of the National Gallery. Freud had lived with the National Gallery in a sense for a long time. And even after the German population voted the Nazi Party into power in 1933, Freud would stay with the National Gallery, at least in spirit. The Freud family decided to flee to London when the Nazis came to power. Ernst, the father, left first, finding a home for the family in North London, and then the boys and Lucy followed. Finally, the grandfather, Sigmund, joined the family. Not all members of the family were able to escape the Holocaust, and several of Sigmund's siblings were murdered in the concentration camp of Theresienstadt, Terezin. That past of Lucian Freud's history, the terror of the Shoah and the Holocaust, is not something that we actually encounter in the work of Lucian Freud or actually in the literature about Lucian Freud much. But I do think that the idea of the end of life, the question of human bodies and human fate, is one that is deeply entwined in the work of Lucian Freud itself. Now, the Freud family were migrants. They were refugees, and they were welcomed with open arms into their new home in London. Lucian, who had always been a precocious and strong-willed boy, was sent to several boarding schools in England, which he either left, very often he left several of them actually, because he attended a lot of them, and some of them he didn't always leave voluntarily. He quite often was expelled from his schools until he found one where he actually had a particularly good relationship with one of the teachers. And this was an art school where his natural interest for painting, for art and art making, was nurtured by a teacher who was probably just as reluctant to accept authority as Lucian Freud was himself. You can see a couple of pictures here of the young Lucian Freud in, I believe, 1956. And then here some of the very first paintings that Freud would have exhibited. On the left-hand side, it's a picture of his teacher Cedric Morris, a Welsh artist of some renown himself. And what you can see is how Freud really operates in a rather folkloristic way of painting, engaging in a painting that is very direct, very unmediated. It was an aesthetic that Morris was teaching his student that involved trying to not embellish the reality, but trying to put it down into canvas and into paint in a way that was very, very raw and very deliberately oriented along the lines of folkloristic painting. At an early age, Freud developed a keen interest in painting, and it would be a passion that he would pursue his entire life. In our exhibition here at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza, we are very, very happy to really show the development of Freud's work over the course of almost 70 years. Freud would develop his style over the course of these nearly 70 years of artistic practice. His early beginnings are in this unmediated, folkloristic style. But they were soon superseded in a heightened interest in a realism that in the end harks back to his artistic predecessors from both the Northern Renaissance all the way to the Neue Sachlichkeit. Now, these stylistic predecessors that I'm naming here, in this case you can see Girl with Roses from 1947, which has a clear relationship to the Northern Renaissance painting that we would have seen by the likes of Hans Holbein, or in this case, a painting by a South German anonymous artist from around 1530. Not only can you see that the motives are similar. Here, Freud equips his model, his then wife, Lorna Wishart, Kitty Epstein. Not only does he equip her with a symbolic flower, in this case a rose, but also he pays meticulous attention to detail in an almost polyfocal way, paying the same kind of attention to each single hair that is painted on the body of the and on the head of the model, as he's paying attention to even the rush weaving of the chair that you can see here. Now, my comparisons that I'm very happy to make to the Northern Renaissance or the Neue Sachlichkeit would all have been comparisons that Freud himself would have rejected. He did not want to see himself in a lineage with particularly German art history, which, knowing about his family history and the history of Germany in the 20th century is, of course, one that one can understand for a refugee and somebody who had to flee that very cultural sphere and politics of the country. What you can see here is actually 1954, a painting that is also in our exhibition, and I think is a real cornerstone of trying to understand Freud and trying to talk about Freud. We see a painting that was painted in 1954 when the artist was only 32 years old. And what you can see is almost becoming a witness to a scene in a private hotel room. This is the Hotel Lucian in Paris, and Freud and his then wife at the time would be in the hotel room. They would live there for several weeks, several months, together with other artists, with musicians, with jazz musicians, with poets, with authors. And what we witness here is, of course, a scene that seems very evocative to us. It seems very emotional. And whenever I listen to visitors in exhibitions and I try to eavesdrop on their conversations, I immediately hear interpretations, oh, this is a marriage on the rocks. Ooh, something they must have had a fight. Something horrible must have happened to them. And of course, that's what it looks like. We see a self-portrait of Freud in the background, in the shadows, looming over the person in the back, in the foreground on the bed. We look out onto the street, onto the other side of the Paris streets, and one of the windows is open and empty. There's kind of an empty feeling in the entire painting. And what I find is very important is that we take this deliberately as a construction. This is not a photograph. It is a painting. And Lucian Freud was a famously slow painter. He would take days, weeks, months to make his paintings. Painting would take hours during the day, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, during which, of course, his wife, his model, and himself would not just stand and lay in a bed. During those hours of making, of course, they would talk, they would laugh, they would maybe have fights, they would read literature together, they would perhaps eat, prepare food, maybe have a glass of wine. There would be all these interactions that people would have in an artist's studio that we do not see when we're just looking at the painting. And it's actually always very interesting to me that when we think of this very strong reaction that we have to a painting like this, oh, a marriage on the rocks, it's also a reaction that the artist would have anticipated. It is something that was created over the course of several months in order to evoke this in us as beholders, and it was evoked by the artist in collaboration with his model. This is not a snapshot that was taken just very quickly, but it is a painting that was arranged and executed over the course of a very long amount of time. In a way, Freud is creating time with his partner to make this artwork over the duration of its making. And that is something that I'd like us to keep in mind for a little bit later. Now, from the 1960s onwards, Freud's style more and more embraces a painterly quality of his medium of choice. He emphasizes brushstrokes, gesture, and expressive application of paint, rendering his subjects and sitters with an enormous psychological intensity. What you can see here is that no longer is the surface of his painting very precious and dealt with as if it were a Renaissance painting. Much rather, we can see every single brushstroke that creates the locks of hair in the example of his self-portrait and the self-portrait of his fellow artist, Francis Bacon. We can also see that the artist names his paintings fragment and unfinished, but the paintings were still exhibited in this state of finish. What the artist is doing is not just showing something that he couldn't bother to finish, but the artist is actually showing us the process of painting itself. There's a real interest in the process and a celebration of painting as an activity. Painting as a skill that takes time and that actually is the consequence of an action. Now, despite the ups and downs of the fashions of contemporary art, and here you can see a different style of painting that he arrived at later, Freud's paintings were recognized as more and more important for the role of figuration in 20th century painting. By the late 1990s, Freud's works were actually commanding among the highest prices at auction of literally any living painter. Here you can see the large interior W11, which actually relates to a famous painting in the collection of the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza by, of course, the French artist Watteau. And this famous interior was painted by Freud using characters and sitters from his own family and personal background, created in 1981. And just to give you an idea of the enormous amounts of market value that his work now commands, the painting was actually sold for more than $80 million. That's not to say anything about its quality, it just says something about the desirability that his works now command, which in itself is an interesting fact. I've given you a bit of a almost potted history of the works of Lucian Freud. And when my colleague Paloma Alarcó and I came together to decide on the exhibition that you can now see in the exhibition spaces above, we were very aware of this potted history, of this way of talking about artists. And of course, talking about artists like Lucian Freud. When we came together to talk about what kind of exhibition we felt was needed to think about Lucian Freud, we really wanted to do something else. We did not want to talk just about the way that artists have been talked about so far, because we discovered that the history of Freud has always been told in the same way. It is very often told like the origin story of a superhero. An archetypal story of the successful genius artist with all its stereotypes, tropes, and lacks of nuance. Very often it is emphasized that Freud was born into a family with an overbearing grandfather, that he was a very rambunctious person who did not want to become anything in life. We then hear a story that is being told about the artist being reluctant but going onto a journey, traveling and becoming a painter, a hero against all odds. The odds in that artist's story are very often temptations. Temptations of bourgeoisie, perhaps. Oh no, I possibly couldn't get married. I possibly couldn't take on responsibility. And then there's the trope of the story, the stereotype of this artist overcoming all of these adversities and succeeding against all odds, against critical adversity, and being elevated to the firmament of artistic success. To all of that, Paloma and I wanted to add a bit of nuance, to really try to question these stereotypes and maybe provide an option to interpret Lucian Freud's work in a slightly different way. In the traditional literature, Freud has almost become overshadowed by his fame. Anecdotes about his adventurous and frankly complicated life have very often taken precedence over the much needed critical engagement with Freud's paintings. The art was being overshadowed by the man. For our exhibition at the National Gallery and at the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza, we then wanted to take a slightly different approach. We deliberately wanted to find new ways of looking at Freud's work. We did not want to focus on Freud as the person itself, not necessarily focus on his sitters. There have been a lot of exhibitions who have done that very well. But we wanted to emphasize the reasons why his actual paintings are still of interest and of relevance. More than anything, we wanted to take some of the categories that have been taken for granted for Freud's work and see if we can find different ways of looking at them. We wanted to find new perspectives. Now, in the exhibition and in its catalog, you will be able to see some examples of these new perspectives that we were trying to find. We are looking at representations of power and in the work of Freud, the iconographical traditions that the artist draws on. To go back to this image, you can clearly see in this self-portrait from 2002 that the artist is using the iconography, the composition, to recall the very famous self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer. Interestingly, while Albrecht Dürer inscribes his painting with his name and the quote, "Here I, Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg, am an artist," Freud uses the same stance as Dürer, but he does actually not inscribe his painting with words, but much rather with the very gestures and material of painting. We see a background full of pigment, full of paint, full of brushes, and full of movement. when describing himself as an artist to the public, he does so in front of the very moment of painting and the gesture of painting and the material of painting itself. In the exhibition and catalog, you will be able to see some other examples. We're looking at representations of power. We're looking at ways that Freud emulated almost forms of court painting, patron relationships, and all of that will become visible to you. But one other subject that we believed deserved a second look and perhaps a new perspective was the notion of intimacy in Lucian Freud's work. Now, what do I mean by that? Freud's work, of course, has always been well known for their prominent exposure of his subjects. The way that artists paints bodies brings the viewer in a position of closeness to the sitter, emulating proximity of space, and even evoking the time that the painter spent with subjects in his studio. Very often these paintings are being described as uncomfortable and sometimes even transgressive. What you can see here is a painting from the very beginning of Freud's career. And you can still see that this is a painting that is influenced by the very interest in photorealism that Freud would have had at that moment of his career. But very soon in the 1960s, you can see that there's a far more expressive brushstroke, a far more higher emphasis on making the brushstrokes visible than we had before. What we can also see, of course, that there's a very strong emphasis on sexuality, on sexual relations with sitters, and the gaze of the sitter is a predominantly male. The gaze of the beholder is a predominantly male one. It's an uncomfortable painting for exposing the models to our eyes in a way that forces our own gaze to become complicit in a nearly voyeuristic mode of spectatorship. We can see that in a whole series of paintings from the 1960s, where Freud is really articulating not just a particular view of the body itself, but also portrays these the women that he works with as his sitters in ways that make us feel uncomfortable in their proximity, in infringing on their space, and almost becoming complicit in a moment of intimacy that feels overwhelming. The gaze, the exposure, and the proximity, which is very often seen as implying a power relationship between the sitter and the painters, and by extension, the viewer, is often seen and described in relation to the category of the erotic gaze. And these are paintings that are actually not in our exhibition, but I thought it was important to show them in this context. Now, here, Freud's act of painting is perceived as one of exposure, of unavoidable proximity, and often as a unidirectional subjectivity and even objectification. It's all entangled in a complicated web of desire, of lust, and bodily presence. There are paintings that are not very often described as being comfortable or tender. They're very often described in words that use a vocabulary of dominance, a vocabulary of hierarchy, and again, the vocabulary of uncomfortableness, of being uncomfortable, that I think is important for us to understand. Eros is the predominant lens which is applied to look at Lucian Freud's paintings here. It's a question of the lascivious view, the lascivious way of looking at the human body, and especially the female body. I think all of this is incredibly important. It is important for us to understand how painting works, how making art can operate, and how the predominant mode of looking at bodies in art up until definitely the 1960s and still to the present day, is very often a male view. a way of looking at bodies that bring us into the position of the still predominantly male artist in our collection. That can be exploitative, that can be difficult, and that can imply a power hierarchy that we, definitely as museums, but also as individuals, need to deal with. Eros is the predominant lens with which Freud's paintings at this time are usually described at. That is important. It's a very useful way of looking at them, and it's very important to also criticize them for that. What is the role of the sitters in these paintings? Are they active agents, or are they passive recipients of the painter's gaze? And if that is the case, what does that make us as beholders? Eros is a powerful concept to analyze artworks with and to criticize artworks with. It can tell us a lot about the role of the painter, the spectator, about relationships, but also about the subconscious and about many, many more things. It's also primordially human, with all its complications, way of looking at the world. Nevertheless, it is also something that has more nuance to it. It is very often the first thing that critics or newspapers want to write about, eroticism. Freud was notoriously promiscuous. He was a self-declared selfish man, an artist who put his responsibility towards his profession, painting, before anything else. He put painting and his independence as an artist before his friends, before his lovers, and before his family. Freud shirked all responsibility other than that to his craft. With more than a dozen children, he was not an active father in the traditional sense. But he rather, as my wife put it, he outsourced all his responsibility as a parent to the several mothers of his several children. Now, that is not for me to judge, it's just for me to observe, and I think it's an interesting and important point to keep in mind when thinking about Freud the person. Nevertheless, when it comes to Freud's paintings, there are also other aspects that we should look at and consider, as well as eroticism or the personal responsibility of the artists who made them. The stories of eroticism, the underlying trysts, romances, affairs, and the erotic relationships very often dominate the writing about Freud. And while the erotic as a category is very important in the work of Freud, in our aim to understand it, it is perhaps not the only one. Much rather, I think it is also worthwhile for us to look to other categories of intimacy in the work of Lucian Freud. Now, what you can see here is the painting Michael Andrews in June from roughly 1965. It's a canvas that is also on display in the exhibition upstairs. And frankly, it doesn't help us much to look at this through the lens of eroticism. Of course, we have a human relationship here, but eroticism is not the first one that would probably be the most beneficial one to understand it. Much rather, in this double portrait, what we see is a category of intimacy that shows us that these two partners, husband and wife, the painter Michael Andrews and his wife June, have a different kind of relationship. We can see that they're actually not looking at each other. They're hugging or embracing each other in a rather uncomfortable, maybe awkward way. We can also see that the composition of the two figures is actually so awkward that even Freud has not quite figured out what is happening with the hands. You can see that there's a slight swirl of paint where we would otherwise suspect the fingers to be. And this awkwardness, the perhaps lack of communication, is something that is also very germane to human relationships. In our relationships, we're not always in love. We're not always looking at each other through the eyes of eroticism. But there's other forms of intimacy that allow for discomfort, that allow for moments of talking past one another, and these moments of human connection or even conflict that are still part of that very relationship. In Greek philosophy and in Greek writing, there are descriptions for different kinds of love, and eros is not the only one. We also encounter the notion of agape. Agape would be the notion of charitable love, or the love of God for man and of man for God. We encounter the notion of philautia, the love of oneself. And at this point, I perhaps should show a clip of the famous drag performer RuPaul and his quote, "If you can't love yourself, how can you love anyone else?" But I don't think I can show that here right now. But we also encounter the concepts of philia and storge, the love of friends and the love of children and parents. This example, June and Michael Andrews, I believe, fits the category of philia, friendship. Friendship that can extend to long-standing relationships, that becomes such an important part of relationships, that include also marriage, that are not always just built on eroticism and not always just built on one single notion of intimacy, but on one that includes living together, loving together, having experiences together, and experiencing life together. And in that respect, I think Michael Andrews and June is an incredibly important painting to express the notion of philia, the idea of people living together, having a relationship together that can be complex, that can be nuanced. Now, of course, there are also other paintings in our exhibition, as well as in the work of Lucian Freud in general. What we can see here is the painting Two Men, 1987 to roughly 1988. And we can see a scene that is happening in the artist's studio. We see the floorboards in the studio. There's a mattress, perhaps a bed. And there's two men in the bed, one dressed, one undressed. They face away from one another. One is clothed, the other one is naked. And of course, there's a certain erotic frisson. Of course, there's a moment where there's a naked body, and we might look at it and understand it in the way of eroticism. Perfectly fine. But there's also something else going on here, because there's no instant titillation. There's no eroticism that is actively being evoked other than a single human touch. A single hand is just resting on the calf of one of the sitters, not moving, just slightly touching, while touching one's heart and looking to the side or perhaps being slightly asleep. While this painting, of course, allows for an erotic interpretation, which is, again, perfectly fine and interesting, I also think it's actually an incredibly tender painting. It's a painting that is also incredibly loving and shows a relationship between two people, in this case, two men, who are, we don't know, perhaps in love, perhaps think of each other erotically, but more than anything, they're comfortable. They're familiar. They like each other's presence. And they share this moment through this moment of touch. It's a very tender moment that also includes a form of love. And I think maybe philia is the best way of describing this kind of love, this kind of intimacy that we see represented here. That's actually very rare in traditional painting. And it's actually, I think, a very, very lovely painting that shows us a lot about the depth of human emotion, the depth of the human experience, and the depth of Lucian Freud as a painter of that human experience. Similarly, we have different kinds of love when we talk about storge. Here we have Bella and Esther, 1988. Bella and Esther are sisters, and Bella and Esther are the daughters of Lucian Freud. They are shown here again in the artist's studio. By now we can recognize the floorboards of the studio. By now, those of you who have seen the exhibition, and this is yet another painting in the show, you might also recognize the sofa that the two girls, the two young women, are actually presented on, that they're showing themselves on. It is a piece of furniture that plays a big role in the work of Lucian Freud. And we can see that these two young women are completely at ease. They're very comfortable. They're very familiar with each other. One of my first reactions when I saw this painting is actually, frankly, to think of my own children. In my case, I have two boys, but when they are home, especially when the big one is home, they lounge on the sofa and they cuddle on the sofa and they sprawl on the sofa, just like I can see it here with those two young ladies. It's a moment of being comfortable, even when the position that we're seeing on the painting is not necessarily comfortable. A bit awkward, slightly crowded. One of the legs has to go over the back of the sofa. But it's a moment of shared intimacy that I think we do not often see in painting, even though we see it very often in life. Eroticism would not help us much to understand this painting. Intimacy, yes, it does. And at that moment, I think I'd like to remind you again of how paintings are made. That even though this seems so real and so familiar, that I immediately thought of my own family as if I were witnessing a moment in somebody else's living room. This is not a photograph. It is a painting. And is again a painting that would have taken weeks and months to complete. Freud would have invited his daughters over to his studio. He would have had dinner with them, lunch with them. They would have gone out across the street where there was a cafe, where they would have had coffee and eaten brioche and croissants. They would have talked about literature. They would have read poems together. They would have talked perhaps about the family, maybe exchanged some gossip. Maybe the girls would have complained that they don't get to see him enough unless he's painting. What would have happened is that they would have spent time together. They would have spent the time in the studio together, and they would have spent the making of this painting together. In a way, Freud creates intimacy through the process of painting. He creates time for the people in his life through painting. I mentioned that Freud considered himself to be a very selfish man, and I believe that is true. He was no model father. But I think it is interesting that in making time, the painting shows not only perhaps two daughters and two children of the artist, they also show the result of spending several months of time together as a family that looks different from mine, a family that looks different from most of ours, I would assume, but a family that does spend time together. In a way, the girls can be seen to occupy the most important places in Lucian Freud's life: his studio and his canvas. Now, that is, of course, me as an art historian interpreting a painting. I do not know how the family or the individual sitters would have experienced this. The family all get on, at least as families do, but I think it is important for us to understand that Freud, by creating this time, also creates the intimacy and the companionship with family, with friends, and with his sitters. It is part of creating intimacy. Now, this is all, of course, fairly uncomplicated when we have a painting like this, where we as a museum are just only too happy to exhibit it, to show a painting that most people will feel very positive about. But when it comes to intimacy and portraying moments of exposure, especially when family is in the game, we also find paintings that are uncomfortable. And one of those paintings, this is actually the London venue, and one of the paintings that I would like to talk about is this painting, Naked Child Laughing, from 1963. This is a painting that was made just at the cusp of when Freud was changing his artistic style, when he was changing from this very meticulous way of paying very close attention to every single bit of the painting, and changing to a moment of really modeling the pigment on the canvas, of emphasizing brushstroke in order to show the artifice of painting itself. And this is also when he starts painting his own family members in the nude, including his own daughters. So what we have here in 1963 is a painting of his oldest daughter, who at the time would have been pubescent, would have been during puberty. And we can see that it is a naked girl. She's laughing, she's kind of hiding her face between her fingers, but also maybe pulling her hair over her head. She's trying to possibly cover up. She's smiling, she's laughing. But it does, especially if we know that this is his daughter, imbue us with a certain discomfort. As a museum, and particularly in a time when we are questioning issues of the male gaze in art and in painting, and questions of consent, it does mean that as a museum, we very often get asked by visitors, is this a painting of abuse? Now, as an art historian, I would say, well, just because somebody is painted in the nude, that's not necessarily a sign of abuse. And everything that we know about the relationship that Freud had with his children, there's no problem there. The sitter herself, his daughter, said that this was all fine and that she absolutely enjoyed spending time with her father and making this painting, even though it was uncomfortable at the time to be painted in the nude by your dad. But that should not mean that we shouldn't have that conversation. What is the actual consent that a roughly 14-year-old girl at the time can give to her father, who's in a position of power, who decides when to spend time with you and when not to spend time with you, and who makes the decision that if we want to spend time together, then we are also working on a painting. This doesn't mean that Freud is setting out to make a lewd painting. But it does raise questions about consent, about power hierarchies, and about questions of how we deal with these issues, not just in 1962, but now in 2023, when we as individuals look at paintings of the past, and of course when we as institutions talk about these power hierarchies and these decisions with our visitors from the point of view of a museum. There's lots of discussions to be had, and I think speaking about them with nuance, speaking about them with different questions of what intimacy is and how it is constructed in art is very important to us. Now, there is, of course, not just the problem, not just the big discussion that we need to have. But by talking about nuance, I think there's also a chance for us to really discover new aspects of looking at the work and discovering new forms of scholarship and research. And that is something that I was very excited to encounter when we had the chance to look at this painting, Sleeping by the Lion Carpet, 1996, in a different way that thinks of intimacy in a more nuanced way. Now, what we can see is a very large painting that you will also be able to encounter upstairs in the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza's exhibition. It's more than 2 meters high, and it's in every way a large painting. It is tall, it is wide, but it also features the extensive body of one of Lucian Freud's most famous models, Sue Tilley. Sue Tilley was an English model, an English sitter who in her day job worked as what is called a benefits supervisor. Her job would be to help people without work to receive their benefits, their daily wages that they would get from the state. And Sue Tilley is still alive. She's still with us. She's still very active. And Sue Tilley was always very proud of her body. And she's a very large person. She has an expansive body. She has an expansive personality. She has a big laugh. And she had a personality that also fascinated Lucian Freud. He met her as a model in the nightclub scene in London of the 1990s. She was a big friend of another model of Lucian Freud's by the name of Leigh Bowery. And when Freud encountered Bowery and Tilley, he literally changed his entire style. He painted larger canvases, he painted in larger brushstrokes, and he painted in a much different way of representing the human body by no longer representing models that conform to any kind of beauty standard that we would find in journals or in fashion magazines, but by painting this body that is expansive in every way. Now, what we can also see, and what you can see even better in the actual painting upstairs, is that this painting has attention lavished onto it. It is made up out of millions of brushstrokes. Freud paints this body sitting on a chair in front of a carpet with enormous care, with enormous attention, in a way, with enormous love. He models the thighs, the knees, the breasts, the arms of this figure with an enormous amount of time, with an enormous amount of attention. And this moment of time and this moment of care that is being invested into this body is quite unusual, especially for non-normative female figures at the time. Now, if we looked at the benefit supervisor through the lens of eroticism, we wouldn't get much further. And actually, when Freud starts painting in the 1990s, that is exactly what happens. A lot of the criticism of the time starts complaining about Freud and starts complaining about this body. There's a lot of criticism that describes this body in very, very derogative terms. She's being called names. Her body type and her weight is being called into question by the critics. There's not so much a criticism of the actual way that the artist paints, but it's almost a criticism of the person that he paints. There becomes, in the mainly English criticism of the time, a conflation of the sitter and the intention of the artist, which also has a class element to it, where she is being described as lazy, that she's being described as not working, in a way that conflates her profession with the way that critics at the time interpreted the painting of her person. There's something very interesting happening, and it's perhaps no coincidence that this view of looking at this body as one that is expansive and needs to be reined in, a body that is transgressive and doesn't appeal to beauty norms of the writers, of the critics, that this view of looking at this body through a mainly erotic lens is mainly the view of male writers at the time. There hardly are any female critics that would start to complain about Freud painting a non-normative body. But the male critics at the time, they have no problem with that. So it is very interesting for us then to maybe set aside that lens of eroticism and look at this painting as one of maybe friendship. maybe a painting of love that goes beyond eros. And when we here then look at the way and the time that Freud spent on painting this body and painting this non-normative figure, then we can really see that he invests care, he invests attention, he invests love into this painting. And if this way of looking at paintings in a different way, by slightly changing our nuance, is something that our exhibition can perhaps encourage people to do, then we have had a good exhibition. Thank you very much.